Thank you very much, and I want to thank everybody for coming. This is a fantastic turnout. We really appreciate it. We know everybody is extremely busy, so this has been actually very heartwarming to see how many people are here today. I also very much want to thank the Albert Shanker Institute, the American Federation of Teachers, and the Hispanic Foundation for not only organizing this, having fantastic panelists and speakers, but also allowing me to participate. So I'm extremely excited to be here. For sake of disclosure, I am not Puerto Rican. Some people have asked me, because I've been doing research on Puerto Rico for the last 5 years. I've been working with Alberto Davila, who is with me at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Our co-author, Avidan Rodriguez, is Puerto Rican. And so we started working on a book chapter about 5 years ago. And we found the more we were digging into the data, there was just such a compelling story and so many interesting questions that came up that it evolved into a book. We have several papers, and it's going to be an ongoing product. So Avidan was at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley as well. He just left for the University at Albany, the State University of New York, for fantastic reasons. He is now their new president of the university, and he is the first Latino president of any of the four-year SUNY campuses, so we're very excited. Sorry we lost him at UTRGV, but very happy for him moving forward. One of the things that we point out a lot of what I'll be talking about is the book that we just released that came out in November of 2017. That was something, we got our galley proofs 2 days after Hurricane Maria struck. And our publisher initially told us we could only make changes to the galley proofs if we found typos. And so we did beg, can we please, we need to add an addendum. And so we do have a couple of pages to address the hurricane. And I sneaked in a couple of other references where I could. So this is why we need to continue working on this project. And one of the things that we emphasized as we were putting the book together is last year, the year 2017, that marked the centennial of the Jones-Shafroth Act. This is the act that granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans by birthright. So we have 100 years of U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico, again, by right of birthright. And yet, at the time, and it's still ongoing, the island was facing a severe economic crisis that had actually started in 2006. We, in the book, kept talking about the crisis, and it just did not seem strong enough, so that's where the La Crisis Boricua came from as part of our title. It's an economic depression that Puerto Rico has been in, and again, 100 years after citizenship, they had been in this economic crisis for well over a decade, and the hurricane came essentially at the worst time because the island was already confronting grave challenges. In addition, the humanitarian crisis did not start with the hurricanes. As we talk about in our book, there was actually a humanitarian crisis last year, pre-Maria, and that's so much of a concern because, again, it was horrible timing for those hurricanes to strike. And one of the things that we generally point out, and when I give different presentations, is why should people care? Why should the U.S. care? Well, again, as we've been hearing from all the different panelists, we've been hearing from the senators, again, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They are U.S. citizens by birthright, and they have been for at this point, more than a century. Puerto Ricans represent also a significant population. Currently, there are 3.3 million Puerto Ricans on the island of Puerto Rico, but if you add to that the 5.3 million Puerto Ricans who live on the U.S. mainland, we're talking about nearly 9 million people who are identifying as Puerto Rican. This is not a trivial population. In some areas of the country, they represent the largest Hispanic group. Nationally, they represent the second largest behind Mexican Americans. It's also important to note that on the island of Puerto Rico, you have, again, the 3.3 million people. That is a bigger population than what 21 states have, and also D.C. And again, as we've heard, we have 5 months after the hurricanes, some people are still without electricity. We're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of people without electricity. I mean, I get annoyed if my electricity goes out for 2 hours, and by that point, it's really frustrating. I can't even imagine what our colleagues and friends are going through after 5 months. And again, 21 states, DC, have smaller populations than 3.3 million. I think we'd be extremely concerned. I think the American people would find it very unacceptable. It's also important to note, because of the massive outmigration, I'll be talking briefly about some of those numbers. That means that the presence and impact of the Puerto Rican population is increasing on the U.S. mainland. Including in Florida, I'm sure that a lot of you have heard the news. Florida, over the past 10 years, 12 years, has received a lot of the migrants from the island. In fact, between 2006 and I'm assuming it has continued today, Florida received 1/3 of all the migrants from the island. Florida is considered by many to be an old new destination. We think about the traditional destination areas for migration from the island, essentially being in the Northeast. So we have, of course, New York is the classic case. But Florida in the 1970s and 80s began emerging as a new destination. So at this point, that's a couple of decades old, so it's not entirely new. Another new settlement area is Texas. Actually, Texas received the fourth largest group of Puerto Ricans from the island since 2006. And that's something that surprises people because it's a population in Texas that was essentially didn't have established Puerto Rican communities until very recently. It's also important to note that the longer this crisis takes to address, the longer will be this vicious cycle. In fact, the other panelists have mentioned it's essentially a cycle because you have net out migration. That is leading to demographic shift. We have a rapidly shrinking and aging population, which has been putting more strain on some of the economic conditions. The economy has been in decline again since 2006, and this has also led to human suffering. Okay. And all this, by the way, was before the hurricane. So when the hurricane struck on September 20th, 2017, it had sustained wind speeds of 155 miles per hour. I've seen reports, the headlines, it was Category 4. Category 4 hurricane. It was Category 5, but boy, aren't we lucky it's Category 4. Now, granted, it's great that the hurricane had weakened slightly. It had been a very powerful Category 5, but at 155 miles per hour, that is only 2 miles shy of a Category 5. In addition, to give you an idea of the scale, the power of 155 mile per hour winds, this is equivalent to an EF3 tornado. And again, it went through the entire island, so it's not a surprise that so much of the island's infrastructure was decimated. The hurricane brought catastrophic devastation and suffering across the island. And again, in the immediate aftermath, the 3.3 million people were entirely without electricity, running water, and telecommunications. Again, 5 months later, I know that a lot of people who do not have electricity have generators, but as one of my good colleagues told me, he said, well, you know, the power generators, everybody has them, but they're only designed to run for emergencies for a couple of days, and so not sustained over several months. We still also have a significant number of households that don't have basic running water and also telecommunications. So the humanitarian crisis is there, but again, it had actually started before the hurricane. We talk about, in our book, we refer to the year 2006 as being the year of the perfect storm. And that was because a lot of factors came together and essentially led to an escalation of already weaker socioeconomic conditions and some of the challenges the island was facing. It's just everything kind of exploded in 2006. What happened in 2006 is there was the complete expiration of something that is called the IRS Code Section 936, and some of the people in this room are aware of this. This was a section of the IRS code that ends up giving tax breaks, or gave tax breaks, to U.S. corporations that operated on the island. It was announced in 1996 that those tax breaks would be phased out over a 10-year period, and so they were completely eliminated as of December 31st, 2005. So 2006 comes, the manufacturing firms and a lot of the firms that had moved there were no longer eligible for those tax credits. For some firms left altogether, other firms scaled back. As a result, you had a significant loss of the private sector jobs. The government did not have as much of the tax base. The government had a lot of wrangles in terms of 2006. How do they deal with, now they had a budget deficit, they had to get their budget in order. So they began imposing some severe austerity measures even at that time, again, back in 2006. A lot of private sector jobs were lost from the manufacturing industry, but we also had a loss in a lot of the public sector jobs. As a result, that started a reaction of a massive net outmigration that is, in fact, if you add up for the whole decade, we've never seen the scale of the outmigration that we've seen since 2006, okay, in terms of numbers. In terms of the size relative to the population, this is the second largest migration that we've seen. The largest migration was in the 1950s with the Great Migration. However, with the hurricane, I would not be surprised if we observe, if we haven't already, the shift in terms of being the largest, both absolute and relative. It's also worth noting that in terms of the outmigration, has been affecting workers from all sorts of different skill levels. It's not just primarily that the highly educated are leaving and less educated workers are left behind. It's essentially across the board. In fact, we don't find evidence of a specific highly skilled group that are in the migrants. But it is worth noting that doctors and physicians have been leaving the island, and that is feeding into some of the healthcare crisis that we're seeing. As a result, again, we have a shrinking and aging population, and that's putting further strains on the healthcare system. There have been a significant loss in bank deposits. As a result, again, you have businesses leaving, you have fewer workers with jobs. So with fewer bank deposits, that means there's less capital, and so it's more difficult to access financial capital, especially at a time when people need it the most. There's a relatively high cost of living. As part of the austerity measures, in 2006, the Puerto Rican government installed a 7% sales tax. At that point, there was a 0% sales tax, so that was, I guess, infinitely increase in that tax. But it was increased in 2015 to 11.5%. I want to note that there's no state that has a sales tax of 11.5%, so it is a significant tax. The island does have this massive debt. We hear about the $74 billion public debt figure, but it's also important to note that the government, there are $49 billion more in unfunded pension obligations. So we're talking about $123 billion. It's not just the 74. There have been defaults on payments to bondholders. We've been hearing a little bit about PROMESA. That legislation has been controversial. It's reinvigorated a lot of debates about Puerto Rico's de facto colonial status. Obviously Puerto Rico is a territory, but it has raised much more discussion in terms of, is it a pseudo-colony instead because of the provisions that were put forth in PROMESA. One of them, you've already mentioned, a couple of speakers have talked about the Oversight Board. The Oversight Board is not beholden to the people of Puerto Rico. And so they have essentially a final line and final say in terms of Puerto Rico's budget, but they are not beholden to the Puerto Rican population. The government was able to file for federal bankruptcy protection through the PROMESA legislation. That was in May 2017. I want to point out, too, that in late 2016, there was an economics consulting firm that predicted that the island's economy would not be restored to its 2006 level until the year 2034. This is before the hurricane, and so that's why I'm surprised with this more rosy scenario that some of these numbers are coming out. That was, I think, the 2034 prediction was like the middle of the road. They had a more severe prediction. It might not be until 2042, and that's just to get us back to 2006. And again, this is all before the hurricanes. Now, you have some blue slides. So I've been going through them. I wanted just to share a couple of numbers. This is more for discussion. But one, I do have a table of our most recent estimates of outmigration, if you want to get an idea of what the scale is. We believe the scale is a little bit larger than what we have been hearing in the news. It's not just about population decline. The Puerto Rican, the population on the island of Puerto Rico has indeed been declining. The U.S. Census Bureau estimated back in 2006, the population was about 3.9 million, and as of July 1st, 2017, again before the hurricane, the population had declined to 3.3 million. That means that we have seen a net population decline of almost 600,000 people. But it's important to note that during the same time period, there's been positive, what is referred to as natural increase. That is, we have more people being born on the island than who have passed away. That was about 130,000 people. So those people, essentially, we're missing more than just the 600,000. We also need to factor in that there has been a positive population increase. Although for 2016, that natural increase did turn negative. So this is just over the entire period. So one estimate that we have is that the net migration from Puerto Rico has been close to 720,000 people, which represents 18.3% of the island's 2006 population. So again, in terms of numbers, that's the largest number we've seen. In terms of relative to the size of the population, the Great Migration in the 1950s was larger. They're about 20%. So we're talking about 1 out of 5 Puerto Ricans who are leaving the island on net. It's one of the other factors that we point out is that most of the migration indeed has been to the U.S. mainland, which is probably not a surprise. But there has been significant migration. We estimate in terms of going to other countries. And I think my fellow panelists just give me some insights into where some of the other countries that they're going to and reasons for leaving. The other figure I wanted to point out is the one immediately below it. And what we have here are estimates of migration flows between the island and mainland since 2006. So we've added together all of the data. And the one that strikes out is the one that is on the far right. And this is the migration between Puerto Rico and the mainland U.S. And you can see the white area, this is out migration, and then the little black area is in migration. So we can see that there was a significant number of people who left the island. It's worth noting that some people did go to the island, so it's not been a complete drain. So the migration would look even worse if there was not some inflows. Florida is the first state that's listed. So these states are listed in terms of their relative size of the incoming migrants. And we can see that Florida has received the bulk of these migrants. And again, it's about a third. We don't have it shown here, but Florida has also received the largest share of interstate migrants here on the mainland. So Florida is picking up migrants from both the island as well as from other states. And then the other states, in terms of their magnitudes, Pennsylvania, New York, Texas, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Connecticut. In terms of the net flows, Texas actually was the second largest if we consider both the difference between in-migration versus out-migration. I'm not going to dwell on the next figure since I know a lot of you may not have this, but one of the things that we talk about in our book is that depending on where people live, their socioeconomic outcomes are different. For example, in the traditional receiving areas, Puerto Ricans who are moving there tend to have lower levels of education and are less likely to be employed than those who are going to some of the newer destination areas. In fact, employment among recent migrants in from Puerto Rico and Texas are quite high. So I guess to get into some closing remarks here, Maria, as well as the slow rebuilding, has escalated this massive exodus. Again, these migration numbers are before the hurricane. Since the hurricane, some of our colleagues at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College under Edwin Melendez have estimated we've had at least 200,000 people who have left the island since the hurricane, which means that we're probably looking at more like 1 million if we add together since 2006. Major industries, including agriculture, have been decimated. They've been decimated physically from the hurricane, but many were already in decline. There are certain challenges that will need to be overcome, including the unpayable debt. We have obviously the PROMESA provisions, demographic shifts, taxes. In fact, this came out of the tax bill, and I believe that Senator Sanders, what he was referring to was how taxes are going to put manufacturers on the island at a further disadvantage. So again, they lost the tax credits they had been receiving back in 2006, but with the latest tax bill, there are taxes on goods produced in what they are referring to as foreign countries. So Puerto Rico, for the purposes of this tax bill, is considered to be a foreign country, which means that U.S. companies that are setting up in a U.S. territory would be subject to these additional taxes on the goods produced with intellectual property. That will further hurt the rebuilding efforts and further put the manufacturers at a disadvantage. So my last remark before we open or go to the next panelist is that it is imperative to rebuild Puerto Rico today and to ease the humanitarian crisis. Again, they are American citizens. I mean, just as human beings, we should be concerned about that. But again, they are American citizens. They've been undergoing and enduring a lot of suffering, not just since September, but over the last 12 years or so. The hurricane has led to more diseases and illness and fatalities because of the slow recovery efforts. So there are more deaths that seem to have happened on the island than what is actually getting picked up in the news. So I'll close my remarks there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marie.